WestWater is a consulting firm focused around water rights and water development. And I first actually want to address a question that was asked earlier about billings. I forget who asked the question, and about municipalities able to utilize or obtain value for their water as they grow into the water right. And in most Western states, this is actually possible. The growing cities doctrine is basically sort of a theory that allows municipalities to essentially, what it says, grow into their water rights. So they don't have to utilize their water right fully, but instead there's a recognition that they need water rights for future use. And so during this time period, many municipalities actually lease their water rights. And we actually just entered into an agreement. And I can't say for sure, actually I was talking with Herth about this, I can't say for sure if Montana has actually adopted the growing cities doctrine, but I know in Washington it does. And we actually just completed a lease for Invenergy and their power plant company from the city of Aberdeen for water. And the city of Aberdeen is not utilizing their water rights to the full. So just kind of thought I would throw that out there, is that there is value for cities that they can obtain for their water rights. But with that said, so I think what was highlighted this morning was that there's a lot of regulatory uncertainty around property rights and water. And so it leaves a lot of people wondering, what can you do with your water rights if you want to sell them? And I think that this is a common question that a lot of people have. So this regulatory risk, it creates unpredictable outcomes. People don't know who are going to object. The rules constantly changing. It's inclusive of many people to object to the process. You don't know the state's response. There is inconsistent on the response. If you own a water right, you don't know what quantity is going to be able to be transferred. You don't know who you can transfer to. You don't know the region that you can sell your water right. There are all these questions that this sort of regulatory process imposes on your asset or your water right. There's also market risk too, in terms of demand absorption. Sort of will the buyers be there when you're ready to sell your water? But I don't want to really focus on that. But essentially, both of these sources of risk, what they boil down to, and we try to, we're economists as well at WestWater and sort of business people, we try to boil it down to sort of simplistic terms if we can. But what these risks impose basically is they impact price or the value of your asset. So the more risk, the lower the price, or the lower the value of your asset. So the result of this regulatory uncertainty is that your asset's being devalued, essentially. I guess given that, though, there is a lot of regulatory uncertainty, and markets are difficult, but they do exist. Water markets do exist, even despite a lack of adjudication in Montana or despite clearly defined property rights. Markets exist and they function. How they function basically is private entities have come up with unique contracting structures that manage the transaction risk in places where property rights are incomplete or murky. In markets with more regulatory uncertainty, you basically have assignment of this risk that I was just mentioning through contracting. So to boil down to basically two basic types of contracts, and I'll actually start with more well-developed markets with property rights are more defined. You have non-contingent contracts and contingent contracts. So in markets where property rights or water rights are more clearly defined, such as Arizona and Colorado, you have what's called non-contingent contracts. This is where financial closing occurs prior to regulatory approval of the transfer. And in these markets, the buyer is okay with owning the risk of the ultimate quantification and improved new use of the water. And the reason that the buyer is comfortable with this is because there's clearly defined property rights. Your use of the water, how much water you own, how much water you can transfer is clearly defined. The buyer's willing to pay in advance because there's more certainty as to what he's buying. And so just an example, we just completed in, I believe, November, and I actually did the valuation. I didn't do the negotiations for this. But WestWater completed basically purchase of 2 blocks of long-term storage credits in Arizona. Long-term storage credits are created in Arizona when you inject either effluent or surface water into underground aquifers. It's very clear. There's an accounting process that's clear. It's posted on the web. Everybody knows how many long-term storage credits everybody else has. And it's also clear what the use of these long-term storage credits are. You can use them to your stored water supply, or you can pull them back out of the ground and use them directly. And so given these clearly defined property rights and clearly defined asset, you see financial closing, we went from contract to closing in 10 days. And the reason it took 10 days was because the lawyer actually was on vacation. And that's unheard of in water transactions here in Montana. So to contrast that, what we see in markets like Montana, and actually most water markets in the western U.S. are these contingent contracts. And these are ways to manage around the risk of the regulatory process. So there's a negotiated unit price between the buyer and the seller, but the negotiated price is per unit based on what's ultimately determined as transferable. And the key part of these contingent contracts is financial closing doesn't occur until after the regulatory process is approved. The risk of the transaction falls entirely to the seller, as opposed to the other markets I was just speaking about where the buyer assumes the risk. In these markets, such as Montana, where it's murky regulatory process, the seller assumes the risk of his unknown asset or unclear asset. So the buyer will share a little bit. Usually the buyer will actually sort of pay for the regulatory process because the buyers typically tend to be higher value water users, power plants, municipalities. So they will, I shouldn't say it falls entirely to the seller. The buyer will assume a little risk in terms of footing the bill for the regulatory process. But essentially, ultimately, the seller is only going to get paid for, whatever survives this regulatory haircut, as we like to say. And I can't claim that term. That's a term my boss uses all the time, so the regulatory haircut. But in contrast to our 10-day closing that we had in Arizona earlier, or in the latter part of 2009, contracts, water transactions in places like Montana, you'd be lucky to go from contract to closing in 6 to 9 months. I mean, these are more like year to 2 year to 3 year processes. So it's the regulatory uncertainty. It's a real issue for water markets and water transactions. So I guess to sum it up is that the markets are working, but they're just not as efficient really as they could be. There's high transaction costs because of this regulatory uncertainty and the length of time it takes to go through the regulatory process. And this creates systematic bias, basically, towards larger deals. Really are the only types of deals that can get done because, to amortize large transaction costs over a small deal just essentially doesn't make sense to enter into small transactions. And the last point I want to make is that it's sort of ironic that almost all Western states have stated policy goals that include enabling water markets to reallocate scarce water resources. However, the administration and regulatory hurdles basically stifle these stated policy goals. They bog down and essentially kill or slow down transactions. They increase transaction costs, create uncertainty, and essentially discourage people to trade. So the same goals that have been stated by the politicians, it seems like the administration and the regulatory process just really stifles those goals. So